Hello, everybody, and welcome to Africa Tech Fest and the stream or the session called Public-Private Partnerships and Why They Are Key to Connecting Africa. We've got two really distinguished guests with us today. We've got Onika McQuarrie, who is the Africa head of the Alliance for Affordable Internet, an absolutely key part of connecting Africa, and also the organization that played a key role in the digital moonshot for Africa, which we can touch on in this conversation. A very exciting and at 140 pages, well worth the read. We've also got Tunde Fakunwa, who's the lead advisor for the Digital Center for Excellence at the United Nations. And really great to have these sort of global organizations present at this conversation and seeing how we can solve or raise the profile of public-private partnerships in Africa. My name is Dion Jerling. I'm the co-founder of Connect Earth. I've spent the last sort of 16 years connecting the unconnected on the ground in South Africa, Zambia, working with teams in Tanzania, and we're also looking at working in Nigeria. It started off with a satellite payphone concept, which eventually ended up in the extension of GSM coverage into rural areas in Zambia. And nice to see now that companies like Africa Mobile Networks have picked up the baton and are rolling out connectivity into rural areas. But my interest then evolved into the broadband connectivity question, because rural areas generally are voice orientated and very little data demand, very little data access. So broadband is a key part of it that will come out of discussions today, and that's really the bit that excites me, and in particular the connecting of African youth, a global asset that the world doesn't know it's got yet. 500 million youth expected from the continent in 2050. We've got this digital moonshot 2020 to 2030, and I think that the PPP element of that is so key to enabling African youth and providing them with the platform and the tools with which they can turn the growth center of the world. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask Tunde and Onika to just give a very brief introduction to themselves and what they're doing, and particularly what they're sort of passionate about in the whole public-private partnership environment. So I think if we do ladies first, Onika, if you give us a brief intro.
Certainly. Hello, everyone. It's quite an honor and a pleasure to join you on this panel today. So my name is Onika McQuarrie. As has been mentioned, I'm the head of Africa for the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which is an initiative of the World Wide Web Foundation. The Alliance is actually the largest multi-stakeholder coalition of technology organizations, private sector, public sector, as well as civil society, who are solely focused on driving down the cost of the internet in order to improve, ensure digital inclusion for everyone. So I'm passionate about this topic, one, because I mean, it's quite a time to be living in this continent at sort of this stage of the digital revolution. But for me, I think personally, I want to make sure that whatever we are doing on the digital front actually benefits Africans, but also that we are on the driving seat of this, which then requires that we actually work together in partnership. Both civil society needs to be part of this, private sector as well as governments. There needs to be sustained investment on digital development in Africa so that we are actually developing in a way that is meaningful for Africans. And that can only happen if it's developed with us, by us, for us, in a way that is collaborative and empowering as well. So I'll just stop there and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that later on.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Tunde Fafunwa, the lead advisor for the Digital Center at the Economic Commission for Africa in Addis. A real pleasure to be here. In terms of public-private partnerships, at the ECA, we very much view the role of the different sectors across the private sector, across civil society that has been mentioned, as really the key to knitting together the various initiatives, many very impressive across the continent, but which are sometimes fragmented. And so the between the public sector and governments, between business and the private sector, and civil society, and the involvement in communities that we're trying to benefit in terms of inclusive growth, to us is where some of the magic needs to happen to accelerate many of these excellent efforts across the continent, but which in many cases we see, are not gaining scale. I think there are lots of successes, lots of pockets of success, very impressive, but I think one of the ways we have to challenge ourselves is how do we accelerate those? Why haven't those scaled as quickly as I think many of us would have liked to see? And what are those elements that we need to have in place in terms of collaboration to really build that transformation across the continent? Thank you.
Great. No, that's fantastic. And both of you highlighted two really, really key points. What the one is the collaboration side of it, and what I point about this needs to be African solutions or African public-private partnerships for Africans by Africans, but bringing in the world. I always default back to my sort of statement that African youth in particular is an asset to the planet. As the planet, the so-called developed world gets older, it's desperately looking for that youth that can keep the economies going over the next 50 to 100 years. And they're here. They are going to be on this continent. They're going to be in Africa. So it's in every single person in the world's interest to invest in Africa now, to empower the continent. And this is not some kind of sort of generous gesture. This is pure investment from a selfish return perspective, and maybe positioning it in that way as opposed to help us. Rather, we can help you, and that sort of falls into the whole thing, into your statement about Africa needing to be African driven, and so I'm wondering if you look at the public-private partnerships, they it's a global phenomena and they are very effective all over the world. And even the UK is doing an awful lot of this, Europe. But how do you see, pointed at Tunde, but how would you see a unique African public-private partnership? What are the unique aspects to PPPs in Africa?
That's a great question. So I'll take a crack at it, but I think that one of the important aspects is the one the colleague has mentioned, which is, involving communities, right? Involving civil society. We're talking about, getting broadband and internet to rural communities. But in many cases, we're not involving them sufficiently, right? They have resources, they have assets in many cases, they have willingness to cooperate. I think the aspect of cooperative type of platforms has not been sufficiently interrogated. Just throw out one number. 40% of electricity in the US is delivered by cooperatives. 40%, covering 70% of the continental US. So the point is that rural communities have huge interest, assets, willingness to cooperate. Sometimes the way we think about organizing these public-private partnerships and cooperations, I think, is subject to some rethinking about how we accelerate. And maybe one of the best ways to accelerate is to involve communities, as has been mentioned.
Indeed. Onika. Oh, I think you're muted, Onika. We can't hear you.
Yes. So if I may just add an example to that. I mean, we have seen some vibrant uptake of community-owned networks as one example of a community coming together as a cooperative, forming a cooperative and developing their own network. It does several things beyond just connecting the community, right? It creates jobs in the rural area. So you take the one, for example, here in South Africa, in the East, where the young people from Mankosi village no longer have to move to Umtata or even Johannesburg, because now they've created a way for them to be meaningfully employed within their own community, providing very useful service for connecting the community. So while that may be just one example, I think it's really important for us to figure out how do we sustain, how do we create an enabling environment for more of this to happen. It's actually not foreign to most African communities to collaborate in this kind of way. So how do we create the kind of policy and regulatory environment that makes it even more easier for us to see more of these zenzeleni, which actually interestingly means do it yourself type of initiatives, because communities are ready and they want to, be involved in their own development. So I think for me, we need to really begin to look at PPPs beyond just the big tech companies coming together with government, but to really figure out how do we create an environment where we innovate around Africa's realities. And our realities is that our communities invented the shared economy. If any of us owned a bicycle when we were growing up, there was a schedule in the neighborhood for when everybody gets a turn to ride my bicycle. So how do we encourage innovation that is rooted in Africa's reality so that we can truly reap the value and benefits of these public-private partnerships?
And I think those, again, very, very key points and very sort of Africa orientated, because if you look at these communities that are looking at community networks in particular, these are very small, and it brings in the question of scale. How does one scale to a level whereby it can become ubiquitous across the continent? You've also got the challenge of unlike India, unlike China, with these vast populations, they're one country. It's much easier to deal with one country than it is to deal with 54 countries. So that is a substantial challenge that needs to be overcome, and highlights the importance of the sort of organizations such as the African Union, the United Nations, which brings in the world aspect, the global aspect. So some comments on maybe how we could potentially overcome those challenges within the African context of being so disparate. Tunde. Sure,
yes, thanks, because this really brings together the key elements. Dion, you talked about youth, and Onika again talked about the community level. One of the pieces that we see is missing, quite honestly, is media and publicity, is getting, these stories are not well enough known. How many people know of this, community level development in South Africa that Onika is mentioning? And I think, in a world of social media and global communications, a lot of these messages are not, and stories are not getting adequately told. Maybe they're getting subsumed with other things, but I think that is one of the keys that, is missing is just not knowing enough, not having these stories well enough told. Of course, following that will, of course, be the need for some kind of research. So there's, intellectual underpinning and results-based information based on these. Because I think when those two elements are in place, then the opportunity to scale, to attract financing, to attract investment, to attract interest from the public sector and others then starts to build from there. So I think we have, to both of your points, some of the elements. These pieces, there's some pieces that are missing still to focus on.
Annika, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we have a starting point, for example, with universal service and access funds, right? That the whole reason why we even have them is, to enable these types of partnerships between government and private sector, so that where it is commercially not viable for private sector to invest by itself, government steps in. But I think where we will begin to see a little bit more success of these is to not only see them as just government and private sector, but including civil society as well. The reality in the continent is that civil society has been filling the gaps where government and private sector is not able to reach, especially in the areas of digital skills development. Civil society has really filled the gap there. And so I think for me, it's really around how do we reimagine the deployment of universal service and access funds as a starting point. It's not sufficient, but it's a great starting point for us to fund, in an innovative way, these partnerships beyond infrastructure as well. Yes, we need connectivity, but we need to address the demand side issues as well, such as digital skills development. So how do we begin to, use these funds for digital skills development, for public access as well? It was really, I was quite fascinated a few weeks ago driving in one of the townships in Soweto, and I was seeing people faced away from the street and leaning inside a fence. And for the life of me, I couldn't understand why would anyone stand like that in the middle of the street. So, curiosity, I turned back and went to find out. And I found out that it's a municipal building that's closed over the weekend, and they're leaning in order to tap into the Wi-Fi. Right? Yep. So for me, it's how do we also begin to address real needs in communities? This is a community that could benefit from public access points. Couldn't universal service funds be deployed for that? And what civil society organizations are involved in expanding some of that. I mean, we saw during COVID lockdowns where certain institutions opened their Wi-Fi to people in the community to be able to tap into it. So we need that innovative thinking beyond just government and private sector. But I think that we've got a responsibility, quite honestly, to utilize our universal service and access funds in a way that truly empowers and begins to really create this demand and address the connectivity needs that our communities have.
So in theory, the funding is already there in the form of universal service funds. It's a matter of tapping into it more efficiently than in the past. I think you mentioned we had a conversation earlier where you said there are some new standards being drawn up on service funds.
Yes, certainly. West Africa under ECOWAS adopted a new Universal Service Act, which really focuses also on accountability, right? Because remember, you are doing this for who? For the public. So be accountable to the public. Let these funds get audited. Look beyond just connectivity and infrastructure for connectivity, but also look at how you fund devices. Hello, another prohibitive cost in the region. So, and actually one where private sector comes in a lot, right? Because that's really who is creating and bringing most of these in. So yes, there's some new standards that we are seeing in terms of how these can be deployed. Botswana has used their fund to also fund public access. Ghana is exploring exploring funding devices as part of, subsidizing devices for teachers, for example, as part of their universal service and access funds. So we need to really look at how we can address all of the needs around this. On the devices aspect of it, devices are quite prohibitive from a cost point of view. And the reality of it is that, you were talking about Africa's youth being the asset for the world. But we are not going to be able to do that being a mobile first and mobile only driven technology innovation. We need to be able to go beyond mobile devices to effectively, go beyond just being consumers of digital products to really creating at the scale at which begins to fuel this vision of a digital economy. So addressing device cost is really important, whether through subsidies, but also, it's not everything has to be subsidized, right? So at some point, perhaps we need to look at our import duty taxation and fiscal policies that add an additional 20 to 30% on the cost of devices. We need to bring our private sector colleagues to talk about local assembly, which helps build new skills within in-country. And, and does the software always have to come already assembled into the devices? Could that not be an opportunity for local content development type opportunity for young people to create those kinds of markets and fields in their country and be able to supply them, which then overall brings down the cost of overall access, the device, the internet, and all of that. So, so we have a lot to really work on in terms of just coming up with some solid agreements between private sector, civil society, as well as government to ensure that we are giving people access to an affordable and meaningful way of connecting online.
And I think the three, you highlighted the handsets, but the three elements of connectivity or access to or broadband usage is handsets or devices, it's access, and of course it's skills. So with those three elements, that will change Africa. It will fast track Africa into this growth center of the world. The trick is, of course, how do we then leverage this public-private partnership environment that is already established but fragmented, because you've got different countries, you've got different interests, you've got different organizations, and different sort of objectives. Your commercial versus your government versus your private sector, not private sector, your social sector. And I love the idea of incorporating your sort of civil society into the whole PPP question. And I think going back to a point you made, Tunde, about media and publicity being one of the lacking awareness. There is so much enterprise in Africa. How do we get that out there? These positive stories. How do we tell the world that Africa is not the pictures that they are used to? Africa is vibrant. It's enterprising. It's successful, and most of all, it's actually happy. And people don't realize this. So outside. So we need to communicate this out there and change the narrative for Africa, so that it becomes positive and it attracts that interest. And I think the UN is in a great position to drive this, and particularly when you look at the economic commissions, where it's all about money. And if you tap into the so-called developed world's desire or need for profitability and success, the ingredients are all here. So how do we publicize this in Africa, do you think?
Great question again, and wonderful conversation. Yes, the United Nations and the Economic Commission for Africa have a key role to play. And we're very, very eager to do that. But so do conferences and forums like this, Africa and Africa Tech Festival, because quite honestly, of course, people are listening, listening to the UN, but listen more to business and corporations and where the money is. So very important that the private sector, supports and provides that, and the media outlets and so on. And I think, there may be a PPP that is needed for this. It might be important enough that we should have a PPP on publicizing, promoting, advocating, identifying successes and how they can be scaled. If I may address a couple of additional aspects. On the public policy side, recently the ECA, along with the African Union, completed a digital transformation strategy for Africa 2020 to 2030 that was adopted at the African Union Summit and Assembly in February of this year. And in there, it identifies key pillars for digital transformation, as you would expect. Infrastructures, you'd expect digital skills, as you would expect regulation and enabling environment, as we've been talking about in terms of the Universal Service Fund, and other cross-cutting areas, e-commerce, digital ID. We know almost 500 million Africans don't have a foundational ID. So I think it provides a very strong baseline for countries and for regional cooperation and agencies to build upon. And that was actually the direction or mandate coming from the heads of state on approval of the document, was for these kind of collaborations, partnerships to help drive transformation at the national and regional level. So I think there is some work and a framework that can be used to pursue some of these key aspects, particularly at the regional level, and supporting national transformation.
Great, and that's what's nice to see is that you've got these globally driven frameworks that can work. You look, which is drawn on experiences from elsewhere in the world, and maybe not haven't factored in the uniqueness of Africa, particularly its distributed country base, but is a good start. And I do think one of the fun things we could probably consider here is a PPP on a sort of media and publicity drive, and by Africa for the rest of the world. Marketing the continent, and every country participates. It brings that unification together. And it's funny. When I was preparing for this, I actually made a note and thought, what about running something like Africa's Got Talent, and we can get Simon Cowell to come in and host it? Quite literally. It's going to require something like that, I think, or something like that would be quite useful in terms of creating this awareness and also attracting these investors. There's rafts of money, despite COVID and the costs that COVID have incurred elsewhere. There's rafts of funding outside ready to invest in Africa, but there's this uncertainty about the continent. So when you've got these structured frameworks, you've got the structured process of public-private partnerships, that trust can be built up and it can attract that funding. The investor just needs to see the long-term sort of benefits of this. So, we've touched on I think some of the key components of PPPs, maybe a little solution or an action that we can take forward there in terms of some kind of marketing or advertising campaign funded as a PPP would be good. But if you were to sum up in sort of maybe just a sentence or two each on what's come out of this conversation, what's really highlighted the importance to you guys, and then we'll end it there. Monica.
Yes, certainly. So, I think for me, just to piggyback on what you've just mentioned, is that telling Africa's story is really important, right? And having that be what grounds our innovation around this area. I will say that, the issue of content, I mean, I know we talked about digital skills and whatever, but the issue of relevant content is equally important, and perhaps one of the things that, universal service funds should be utilized for. Because if you think about it right now, we want to connect everyone, and we want them to be online, but we want them to do what, fundamentally? I mean, still a majority of the content online is in English, mainly, meaning that more than half of the dwellers of this continent are not able to access that information. So how do we begin to develop the talent of digital content creators within the region, most of them young, and utilize them for, creating this relevant content that we need in order to drive the digital economy that we are imagining. And the content is there because, I mean, we've had Nollywood, we've had, the content is certainly there. I think it's just an issue of really investing in it and harnessing it so that it truly tells the story of Africa. But lastly, I think what I will also mention is that it's really important as we develop these for us to be intentional about closing the gaps, including income gaps, but mostly also digital gender gap. Because the digital gender gap is really what's going to hold us back, even in the partnerships that we are creating. If we are not thinking about how are we centering women, how are we making sure we are creating gender equality, then we are not going to reach the kind of potential that we are expecting to reach, because that's leaving 52% of the continent's population is women. And so it's really important that as we develop these, we really develop them around women. We've seen a lot of digital centers that have been built that became underutilized later on because they were built either in places that are too remote for women to access, not as safe for them to walk to. So it's kind of the same tenets that we went through when we were creating access to water, access to electricity. We need to really look at how we are mainstreaming our policies and regulations to meet everyone and make sure that we are closing all of the societal gaps that are created in social development.
Great. So inclusion is a multifaceted recruitment. It's not as simple as it's made out often. Tunde, any final remarks?
Yes, thanks. Out of this, I would say that there are key successes out there, as we've heard from Annika, and I would also add at the major corporate level as well, in terms of African mobile operators have come together with the ECA to launch a African communications and information platform to support health and economics, and that includes MTN, Orange, Vodacom, and Airtel. It covers more than 80% of the 630 million unique mobile users across the continent, and they've committed to deploy that on a narrowband mobile platform of interactive voice response and the USSD shortcode, no charge.
Fantastic. So
these kind of PPPs that we're talking about are very practical. They're very possible when the right objective is set and the right stakeholders come together, and they can scale across the continent. As we've said, though, the importance is to involve communities, and again, I'd take that as a key takeaway from here, is that Africa is very diverse, obviously, but one of the key elements is the community approach. And I think a lot of times we miss that out from an individual approach, a very fragmented approach, instead of realizing that perhaps maybe the most effective way and most relevant way is from a community approach, as we've discussed here. And we should take advantage of that. We should utilize that. And of course, we should promote that with its own PPP, as we discussed. Thanks.
Right too. Well, thank you, Onika, Tunde. Thank you both so much for your input. I can't believe 40 minutes has just gone like that. It's extraordinary. But I think I would encourage anybody who's listening and who's interested in taking this further to please get in touch with us or any of us and see where we can go. If there are any media and advertising people out there, there is a fantastic PPP in the pipe. And I honestly am going to liaise with Onika and Tunde going forward and see if we can make that a reality. And that would be a really great thing to take away from this Africa Tech Fest conversation. So guys, thank you so much, and look forward to hearing what comes out of this.
Thank you.
Terrific. Take care then. Bye-bye.